I have watched enough monopolies collapse to recognize that their endings are never gradual or negotiated. Monopolies do not slowly lose market share while adapting to competitive pressure. They do not negotiate their own dissolution with emerging competitors. Monopolies persist at full strength until the moment when competitive alternatives achieve sufficient scale to offer customers viable options. Then, monopoly power collapses completely and irreversibly, because customers who have endured monopoly pricing for generations immediately switch to alternatives the moment those alternatives become available. The American processing monopoly over Canadian critical minerals persisted at full strength from 1945 through 2024, 80 consecutive years during which Canadian lithium, rare earths, uranium, nickel, and cobalt extracted from Canadian territory achieved maximum value only after processing through American facilities operating with monopoly power over these transformations. Not weakening monopoly, not contested monopoly facing incremental competitive pressure. Complete monopoly maintained through structural advantages so overwhelming that Canadian competition appeared economically impossible. That monopoly ended in 2025, not gradually, not through negotiated market sharing arrangements, completely and permanently through deployment of $280 billion in competitive processing infrastructure at sufficient scale to match every structural advantage that had maintained American monopoly for 8 decades. The monopoly that had appeared permanent and unbreakable collapsed when confronted with competition built at scale sufficient to offer customers genuine alternatives to monopoly suppliers. To understand why this ending was inevitable once investment reached sufficient scale, you must first understand how American processing monopoly had been maintained for 80 years without requiring explicit protection or enforcement. The monopoly operated through 4 self-reinforcing mechanisms that made Canadian competition economically irrational, regardless of Canadian technical capacity or resource endowments. First mechanism was capital amortization asymmetry. American processing facilities for lithium, rare earths, and uranium had been constructed decades ago with capital investments that had been fully amortized through years of profitable operation. These facilities operated with minimal capital costs because their construction debts had been repaid and their equipment had been depreciated to book values approaching zero. Any Canadian competitor building new facilities would face the full burden of capital costs immediately while competing against American operations, operating essentially capital-free due to complete amortization of historical investments. This asymmetry meant that Canadian processors would need to charge prices sufficient to cover both operational costs and capital recovery, while American monopolists could price based purely on operational costs because their capital had been recovered decades ago. In competitive markets, the party with lower costs wins. American facilities with zero capital costs could always underprice Canadian competitors carrying full capital burdens, making Canadian investment economically irrational because losses were mathematically certain. Second mechanism was operational learning accumulated over generations, processing lithium into battery-grade compounds, separating rare earth elements into individual purified materials, and enriching uranium to reactor specifications are extraordinarily complex operations, requiring deep technical expertise. American facilities had been perfecting these processes for decades through continuous operational experience. Every problem encountered had been solved. Every inefficiency had been eliminated. Every optimization opportunity had been captured. The accumulated knowledge represented generations of institutional learning that could not be purchased or rapidly replicated. Canadian facilities starting from zero would initially operate at lower efficiency than American competitors who had perfected their processes through decades of experience. This efficiency gap meant Canadian processors would have higher operational costs, even if capital asymmetry could somehow be overcome. Higher capital costs plus higher operational costs versus competitors with minimal capital costs and optimized operational efficiency made Canadian competition appear certain to generate losses rather than profits. Third mechanism was scale economy advantages. Processing facilities achieved dramatically lower per unit costs at larger scales because fixed costs, including facilities, equipment, utilities, and administrative overhead, spread across more output. American facilities processing the majority of global lithium, rare earth, and uranium supply operated at scales achieving cost efficiencies that smaller competitors could never match without processing comparable volumes. But capturing comparable volumes required taking market share from monopolists who could leverage their cost advantages to defend their positions through aggressive pricing that made competition unprofitable. This created a classic monopoly trap. You cannot achieve competitive scale without capturing market share. You cannot capture market share without competitive pricing. You cannot offer competitive pricing without achieving scale economies. The circular logic made entry appear impossible because every pathway to competition required first achieving something that competition was necessary to obtain. Fourth mechanism was downstream customer inertia. American processing facilities had maintained supply relationships with battery manufacturers, technology companies, and reactor operators for decades. These customers had structured their own operations around American supply reliability. Qualifying alternative suppliers required extensive testing and validation. Integrating new sources meant modifying procurement systems and potentially retooling production processes. The switching costs made customers reluctant to adopt Canadian alternatives, even if those alternatives offered marginal cost advantages, because the risks and expenses of switching appeared to exceed potential benefits. These four mechanisms, capital asymmetry, operational learning gaps, scale economy disadvantages, and customer switching costs, created a monopoly structure that had persisted for 80 years without requiring explicit protection. The economic logic was so overwhelming that Canadian attempts to compete appeared financially suicidal. Every analysis of potential Canadian processing investment concluded that competing against American monopolists with these structural advantages would generate certain losses. Mark Carney's recognition was that ending this monopoly required investment at a scale that eliminated all four mechanisms simultaneously rather than addressing them incrementally. Not pilot facilities demonstrating technical feasibility while remaining subscale. Not partnership arrangements that maintained American participation and therefore American leverage. Complete competitive infrastructure at scales matching American capacity, funded with sufficient capital to sustain operations through the learning period required to achieve operational parity, and supported by commitments to downstream customers that overcame switching cost barriers. $280 billion represented investment sufficient to eliminate monopoly power by matching monopolist advantages across every dimension simultaneously. The scale of commitment was essential because addressing any single mechanism while leaving others intact would have left Canadian processors at permanent competitive disadvantage. Only by matching all advantages simultaneously could Canadian processing become genuinely competitive and therefore capable of ending American monopoly. Lithium processing investment demonstrates this comprehensive approach. $40 billion built facilities in Ontario at scales comparable to the largest American lithium processors globally. Not smaller facilities that would operate at permanent cost disadvantage. Capacity sufficient to process substantial portions of global battery-grade lithium demand at per-unit costs, matching the most efficient American operations. Scale was non-negotiable because operating subscale meant accepting permanent cost disadvantage that would make competition unsustainable. But scale alone was insufficient if Canadian facilities operated less efficiently than American competitors. Additional investment funded recruitment of experienced lithium processing engineers from global operations and supported years of operational optimization to achieve efficiency parity with American facilities that had perfected their processes over decades. The facilities were intentionally designed with flexibility to test multiple processing approaches simultaneously, accelerating the learning curve that would otherwise have required generations to traverse. Customer switching costs were addressed through long-term supply agreements with European and Asian battery manufacturers, offering volume commitments and pricing security that made adopting Canadian supply economically attractive despite qualification and integration costs. Canadian processors absorbed testing expenses and provided technical support that eliminated customer barriers to switching from established American suppliers. The cumulative investment eliminated every mechanism that had maintained American lithium processing monopoly. Capital asymmetry was overcome through upfront funding that made Canadian facilities capital competitive with fully amortized American operations. Operational efficiency was achieved through accelerated learning, supported by engineering talent and operational flexibility. Scale economies were captured through facilities sized to compete on cost with the largest American processors. Customer switching costs were eliminated through commitments that made Canadian supply adoption economically rational. The result was genuine competition where monopoly had existed. Canadian lithium processors offered battery manufacturers alternatives to American monopoly suppliers at competitive prices with comparable quality and reliability. The monopoly that had persisted for 8 decades faced competition that matched its advantages across every dimension. And monopoly power, which depends on absence of alternatives, collapsed the moment alternatives became available at competitive scale. Rare earth processing monopoly ending followed identical logic but confronted even more formidable barriers. American rare earth facilities were among the most technically sophisticated processing operations globally, achieving separation of 17 chemically similar elements to purities exceeding 99.9%. The technical barriers were so substantial that very few facilities worldwide possessed comparable capabilities, concentrating processing power in American hands to an extraordinary degree. $60 billion systematically eliminated these barriers through the same comprehensive approach. Facilities were built in Quebec at scales matching the largest American rare earth processors. Technical expertise was acquired through recruitment of experienced rare earth chemists from global operations. Operational efficiency was developed through years of process optimization funded by sufficient capital to sustain operations during the learning period. Downstream relationships were established with European and Asian technology manufacturers through supply agreements that overcame customer switching costs. The monopoly that had appeared unbreakable due to extraordinary technical complexity and concentrated capacity faced competition that matched its technical sophistication and operational scale. Canadian rare earth processors offered technology manufacturers alternatives to American monopoly supply at competitive prices with equivalent purity and reliability. The monopoly collapsed because the structural advantages that had maintained it for 80 years were systematically matched by competitive investment at sufficient scale. Uranium enrichment monopoly ending addressed the most concentrated processing market globally. Uranium enrichment requires technology subject to extraordinarily strict international safeguards and export controls. Very few facilities worldwide possess enrichment capability, creating processing concentration that made American-European duopoly over enrichment services nearly absolute. The barriers to competition appeared insurmountable because enrichment technology is among the most restricted and difficult to acquire globally. $50 billion built enrichment capacity in Saskatchewan that broke this duopoly by creating competitive alternative at comparable scale and technical capability. The investment was sufficient to acquire technology through licensing from established operators, recruit experienced enrichment engineers, and construct facilities capable of producing both reactor-grade and advanced high-assay, low-enriched uranium at volumes comparable to established enrichment plants. The duopoly that had controlled uranium enrichment for decades faced competition that offered reactor operators alternatives at competitive prices with equivalent quality and reliability. The pattern repeated across every critical mineral, where American facilities had maintained processing monopoly. $280 billion systematically ended every monopoly by building competitive alternatives at sufficient scale to match monopolist advantages, not subscale facilities that would remain competitively disadvantaged, not incremental capacity additions that monopolists could accommodate through modest price adjustments. Complete competitive infrastructure at scales that made monopoly power unsustainable because customers suddenly possessed genuine alternatives. The economic consequences of monopoly ending are profound and permanent. Monopoly pricing power, which had allowed American processors to charge premiums substantially above competitive market prices, disappeared because customers could and immediately did switch to Canadian alternatives when monopoly suppliers attempted to maintain premium pricing. The monopoly rents that had enriched American processors for 8 decades were eliminated by competitive pressure that forced pricing to levels justified by operational costs rather than market power. But the strategic consequences exceed economic ones. American leverage over Canadian resource policy had derived from monopoly power over processing. Canadian materials achieved maximum value only through American facilities, giving those facilities choke point control over Canadian resource monetization. Ending the monopoly eliminated this leverage because Canadian resources now achieve maximum value through Canadian processing. The strategic dependence that monopoly had created was ended by competitive alternatives that made American processing no longer essential to Canadian resource economics. American processing companies acknowledged monopoly's end with remarkable candor. Congressional testimony in late 2025 included statements from lithium processors reporting that Canadian competition had eliminated pricing power they had exercised for decades. Rare earth processors stated that customers were demanding price reductions to match Canadian alternatives. Uranium enrichment facilities reported that long-term contracts were being renegotiated at substantially lower prices, reflecting competitive pressure from Canadian capacity. These testimonies documented not just emergence of Canadian competition, but complete collapse of American monopoly power. The pricing premiums that monopoly had sustained for 80 years disappeared because customers switched to alternatives the moment those alternatives became available. The market share that monopoly had protected was suddenly contested because customers no longer accepted that American processing was their only option. The leverage that monopoly had provided over Canadian resource policy evaporated because Canadian processing eliminated dependence on American facilities. I want to emphasize why monopoly endings are permanent rather than temporary. Monopolies can persist for generations as long as competitive alternatives remain absent or subscale. But once competitive alternatives achieve sufficient scale to offer customers genuine options, monopoly power cannot be restored even if the former monopolist retains operational capabilities. Customers who have switched to competitive alternatives will not voluntarily return to monopoly suppliers unless competitors fail operationally, which is unlikely when competition operates at comparable scale and efficiency. The permanence is reinforced by competitive dynamics that emerge once monopoly ends. Canadian processors invest continuously in efficiency improvements and capacity expansions to capture market share from former American monopolists. American processors invest in similar improvements to defend their market positions against Canadian competition. This competitive dynamic drives continuous innovation and cost reduction that benefits customers, while making reemergence of monopoly progressively less likely as competition intensifies. The infrastructure that ended American monopoly exists independently of political decisions and will continue operating as long as demand persists and facilities remain cost competitive. A lithium processing plant in Ontario that cost billions to construct will not be closed voluntarily because doing so destroys asset value and eliminates profitable revenue streams. The facility continues operating, continues competing with American processors, and continues ensuring that monopoly power cannot reemerge. The expertise developed in Canadian processing operations persists in personnel who will not forget their knowledge if political conditions change. Chemical engineers who perfected rare earth separation processes retain that expertise regardless of diplomatic considerations. This human capital makes Canadian operations progressively more efficient over time, strengthening their competitive position and making monopoly restoration impossible. Customer relationships established between Canadian processors and global manufacturers create dependencies that resist disruption. European battery companies that integrated Canadian lithium supply into production planning will not abandon those relationships without compelling reasons. Asian technology firms that depend on Canadian rare earth reliability will not switch back to former monopoly suppliers, whose monopoly pricing they endured for decades. These relationships, once established and proven reliable, exhibit enormous inertia that reinforces competitive market structure. The historical significance extends beyond Canadian-American relations. This represents the first time in the post-war era that a resource-rich nation has systematically ended American processing monopoly over its critical minerals through competitive investment at sufficient scale. Other nations had attempted incremental capacity additions or partnership arrangements that maintained American participation. Canada demonstrated that monopolies end only when competition is built at sufficient scale to genuinely match monopolist advantages rather than operating at permanent competitive disadvantage. For 80 years, American processing monopoly over Canadian critical minerals appeared unbreakable. The structural advantages were so overwhelming that competition appeared economically impossible. Capital asymmetry, operational learning gaps, scale disadvantages, and customer switching costs created barriers that seemed insurmountable without American cooperation. $280 billion ended that monopoly by systematically matching every advantage that had maintained it. Canadian processing facilities operate at scales comparable to American operations. Canadian technical efficiency matches decades of American operational learning. Canadian customer relationships eliminate the inertia that had protected American market positions. The competition is genuine, sustained, and permanent. The monopoly that persisted at full strength for 80 years collapsed completely when confronted with alternatives at sufficient scale. What exists now is competitive markets where monopoly once dominated. And competitive markets, once established through investment in alternative capacity at sufficient scale, persist regardless of whether former monopolists wish monopoly conditions would return. History will record that $280 billion ended 80 years of processing monopoly. The investment was large because the monopoly was entrenched. The ending was complete because the investment matched every structural advantage. The transformation is permanent because the competitive alternatives exist at scales that make monopoly restoration impossible. By the time most people understand what occurred, the monopoly will be so thoroughly ended that questioning its permanence will appear absurd. This is how monopolies that appear eternal actually end. Not through gradual erosion, but through sudden collapse when competition achieves sufficient scale to offer customers alternatives. The 80-year American processing monopoly over Canadian critical minerals has ended. What remains is competition that will persist as long as the infrastructure exists and operates competitively. And infrastructure, once built at scale sufficient to compete effectively, does not voluntarily cease operations to restore monopoly conditions that enriched others at customer expense.